speaker for today.
Great. Thank you, Julianne. Well, we're back here again in this wonderful Oak Room, and so many of us are here. It's really super to get back to real life after 3 years of Zooming. But I do want to welcome the Zoom people. We have, looks like 14 participants on Zoom, which is a wonderful thing to have. I kept up for 3 years with all my meetings and everything else I wanted to do by Zooming. A little balmy at the end of some days, too much computer time. Today, we have a marvelous speaker for Adventures in Living. And there are a lot of people here who've known Anne for quite some time, and I want to welcome you all here today to enjoy her presentation. When I think I mentioned last week that right before the presenters present, we ask them for a few sentences that we can use to introduce them. And I asked Anne twice, and twice she said, "Keep it short." So I'm going to do that this morning because she's going to tell us a lot about a very full and fascinating life. So with that, I will introduce Anne Meyers, who will be with us for questions at the end. So enjoy. Julianne?
Before I begin my life story, I'm going to give you a bit of background to my family. I was the firstborn child of Dorothy Nee Donner and Val Sauerwein. My mother's ancestry was German and Swiss, and my father's was German. The religion on my mother's side in Switzerland was Anabaptist, an uncompromising fundamentalist Christian religion. These people were not popular, as they would tell others that they were sinning for one reason or another. They immigrated to the United States and settled in the Peoria and Springfield, Illinois area. My mother's grandfather was a shoemaker. One of his customers was Abraham Lincoln. When a pair of shoes was finished for Mr. Lincoln, he would come and stay long enough to have a piece of lemon meringue pie. That's supposedly his favorite pie. And I still have the recipe. My grandfather, born in 1861, actually saw Lincoln. My grandfather was the credit manager at Joseph Horn Department Store in Pittsburgh. And that's where he created the prototype for the credit card. In 1912, my grandfather went to work at a publishing company in Cleveland, Ohio. He also became a lay preacher. My father's father, also born in 1861 in Hesse, Germany, came to the United States as a tool and die maker. The second of his two wives was my grandmother. The four sons of my grandfather were all college graduates. When my grandmother, who was a cook in a well-to-do family in Cleveland, and my grandfather were married, he supposedly forgot to tell her that he had not 3 but 4 sons, and that one unmentioned was Herman. My father had a beautiful tenor voice. He began the Glee Club at Case Institute of Technology, and he paid for his college tuition by singing at weddings. One of his sisters was a classmate of my mother at Western Reserve University. My mother had been accepted to Western Reserve School of Medicine, but when she learned that she would be the only girl in the class, she declined to enter medical school and married my father instead. Now, my story. What you're going to hear is my life in sketches, beginning age 4. I ran away from home. I do not remember if I was being scolded for any reason, but more a case of a sense of adventure. I did not travel far, just to the end of the street before returning home, and crawling under the piano, I announced, "I'm not here." This was the year I became interested in kitchen skills, as I was always hungry. My first efforts were making open-faced sandwiches of Wonder Brand white bread smeared with mayonnaise. I haven't made that sandwich in a long time. Age 5, I was given a second-hand two-wheel bicycle and thought it'd be easy to learn to ride, especially if I went down a hill. Trouble was that I did not know how to stop, so I crashed into a row of mailboxes. I was a mess, though I did make it home on my own. Next lesson was how to brake. The red bird on my paper is a cardinal. My mother was so happy I could draw and color something she could recognize. My first opera was Hansel and Gretel. I wore a black velvet dress with a white lace collar and black patent leather shoes. I remember all the angels gathered around the sleeping children on the forest floor. Kindergarten was wonderful. One day, on my way home from school, 2 boy classmates tried to kiss me, and in a rage, I threw a very rotten apple and hit one boy in the face, and he threw up. My parents sent me to summer school at Western Reserve University to take a conversational French course. At 5, I was the youngest student. My picture was put into the Cleveland newspaper. Small comfort. Didn't like the course, but I finished it and learned some French. Being a daughter of German culture parents, I really had no choice but to accept that I would learn French. Now we go to 1941. My Aunt Lois, a surgical nurse, took a vacation to Hawaii. Like many in the family, she loved chocolate candy, and as soon as she was registered at the hotel, she went out to buy candy and returned to the hotel with a bag of Hershey Kisses. She offered candy to the desk clerk, and then turning to a man standing at the desk, she asked if he would like to have a kiss. His response was to invite her to dinner, where in the conversation they told each other how much they enjoyed their life as a single person. The chemistry clicked because he proposed and she accepted. When the wedding day came, he, soon to be Uncle Jack, brought gifts for all the family members. My gift was a collection of Hawaiian seashells, which I thought was a marvelous gift. And over the years, I have enlarged my collection of vintage shells. And in 2022, I donated my collection to Whitney Laboratory to display in the soon-to-be-built Marine Animal Hospital on campus. After a honeymoon going orchid hunting in Costa Rica, my aunt and uncle returned to Honolulu. 3 weeks later, Pearl Harbor was bombed. Aunt Lois spent that Sunday tending to the wounded laid out in cane fields, most of which were burn victims. Uncle Jack was a territorial tax commissioner of Hawaii before it became a state. About the same time, my family moved to a rural area turning suburban, east of Cleveland. I attended a school with 1st through 12th grades in one building. The kindergarten was in the local orphanage. The classes were small, but I had the good fortune to have classmates who had above average intellect and not one behavioral problem in the group. Class reunions were held through our 60th anniversary. Professions chosen by my fellow students were engineering, teaching, an inventor, a doctorate in thermodynamics who went to work at the Jet Propulsion Lab in California, labor lawyer, and a Rhodes Scholar. There were 2 African-American girls. One was very pretty, maybe as lovely as the Queen of Sheba. We had a vegetable garden, and when World War II started, we never lacked for vegetables. With more food than we could can, my brother and I peddled beautiful tomatoes from a wagon for 50 cents a bushel. Liking music, I wanted to play an instrument. There I made a poor choice, as the cello was tough to lug home on the school bus. Next choice was a clarinet. For the 3 years of high school, I transferred to a girls' boarding school in a nearby town. This particular school had a curriculum that educated girls to be independent in a choice of 6 fields, and my choice was art. The school buildings were all red brick Georgian, and the campus was large, with one end being a farm. There was also an equestrian center. The highlight of the 11th grade was putting on prom dresses and listening to the radio broadcasting the wedding of Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. 1949, time to think about college. Both my parents were college graduates, and that they felt I should attend the same university as my mother and then probably marry a young man, a graduate of the same college as my father. That is how my college education began, and I was miserable. So when the second semester began, I presented my art portfolio at Cleveland Institute of Art and was accepted and then about 6 weeks into the semester, I told my parents I was not going where they thought I was going. At that point, my father exploded with rage. About 2 later, when he had calmed down somewhat, he said, "Okay, Ann, that's what you want, then okay, but you pay for it." From the time I drew that red bird at age 5 to the painting that is in the current Oak Hammock Gallery exhibit, art has been a significant part of my life. Here is a short sample of my work. Though I had switched to art school, I still had an interest in geology. So my best friend Elaine invited me to go with her on a class field trip to a limestone quarry in the northwest corner of Ohio. We spread out in the quarry looking for fluorite, calcite, marine fossils, etc. After about an hour, I took a break, and looking up the quarry face, I saw a fissure in the rock with feet sticking out of it. I called up, "What have you found?" And the person backed out of his little spot and replied, "Needle crystals of strontium." Now that seems ordinary, but those were the first words he said to me by the man who had become my husband for 68 years. Strontium sulfate is also known as celestite. It has a delicate blue color and is commonly used in fireworks and metal alloys. We began dating in January 1951. Since our campuses were near to each other, I would sometimes cut a class to sit in on one of Joe's classes. This was acceptable with a professor. Joe graduated from Western Reserve University mid-year class of 1952. He had a BS in geophysics. We are now engaged, and I sadly say goodbye as he leaves for Naval Officers Candidate School. The Korean War is full blown. Our plans are iffy, but there is no doubt I will finish my senior year. My major is jewelry and enameling with a minor in graphic arts. So far, I have no school debt as I worked as a waitress, and tuition and school expenses were reasonable. In the spring, I design and make our wedding rings. Our wedding plans begin, contingent on Joe's completion of OCS in July. Wedding date set for July 29th, 1952. Joe is now a handsome ensign. Our wedding was held in the splendid Neo-Gothic Baptist church with a reception in the church courtyard. No disc jockey, band, or alcohol. This was a Baptist church. Joe was piped aboard ship the following Tuesday. His assignment as engineering officer on the USS Maury. The assignment for the Maury was to plot the Caribbean and North Atlantic up to Nova Scotia. This was the early days of space exploration prior to John Glenn's and Alan Shepard's trips to space. During his Navy stint, he survived 2 helicopter crashes at sea. Others aboard ship were not so lucky. One helicopter crashed on a Bahamian island and the 4 sailors were burned to death. Meanwhile, I finished my senior year at Cleveland Institute of Art, and then I began to look for a job. The Cleveland Clinic offered me a job as a medical illustrator at $1 an hour. I did not accept, as the clinic would not guarantee a 40-hour work week. Instead, I was hired by Ohio Bell Telephone Company as a service representative at $1.25 an hour. This was pleasant work with nice people. As many men were still in service, I was asked to help plan some courses for women employees for after-hour activities. Great books was a popular choice, and I taught enameling on copper and simple mosaic projects made from glass tesserae in beautiful colors. 1958. For my volunteer work, I joined Cleveland Council on World Affairs. At this time, hospitals and colleges were accepting foreign medical doctors and graduate students. It was felt that the foreign students and their wives would acclimate better if they were matched with an American family who would help them adjust and share holidays with them. This proved to be a very successful undertaking. I did the pairings for Cleveland Clinic and found this work very rewarding. In fact, 2 of these couples, one from Japan and the other couple from India, who had settled in Canada, came to Palm Coast to help celebrate my 75th birthday. Until I became involved with Cleveland Council on World Affairs, I had never met anyone from India. My interest with India began when I read The Jungle Book by Kipling as a youngster. My interest continued to grow, and as college freshman, my best friend Elaine, who was still my best friend, planned that when we were, quote, women, we would someday travel to the Vale of Kashmir. 36 years later, we made the trip, and it was awesome. I've added 5 more trips to India since then. Jumping back to post-graduation, an Indian doctor, orthopedic specialist, asked if he could cook an Indian meal at my apartment. I said, okay. The dinner was chicken curry. At the first bite, I knew I was in trouble. The food was so spicy, I was in pain for hours. The flavor was great, though, so I altered the recipe to suit an American palate. Then in 1955, I saw a notice in a ladies' magazine for a Cook with Ketchup contest sponsored by the H.J. Heinz Company, and there were 6 categories. I chose the chicken category, and I won first prize of $1,000. My picture was in an issue of McCall's magazine. That caused extra mail to come to me, like investment proposals, begging letters, and 2 offers of marriage. My husband was discharged from active duty in July 1955, and he began law school at Western Reserve School of Law in the fall. I was not thrilled with him choosing law and wrote him a letter to that effect. He was not deterred. I found that letter 2 years ago when I went through his personal effects after his death. He was the only one in his class who chose the corporate world rather than a firm. In 1959, we purchased a starter home and settled into normal married life. In 1963, we adopted a 3-month-old baby boy. Doug was a lovely little fellow, very alert, and he knew how to read before entering kindergarten. We had a Great Dane, Willow, who acted like his nanny. She even let him take some of her food out of her food dish. Her patience stopped when he bit her tail. Doug died in 2013 at age 50. 2 years after adopting the first baby, we adopted Alan, age 7 months. This child was not as easy to raise. He was a baby that did not thrive. His head was misshapen, his crotch area needed to be covered with plastic skin because his excessively strong urine burned his skin. Feeding time was tough as he ate little and frequently vomited the little he ate. He was so spindly that he weighed 17 pounds at age 2 when he first began to walk. He had apricot-colored hair, gray-green eyes, and a smile so wide it almost split his face. School was always a struggle for him, and at age 16, he announced that he was not going to go to school anymore and we couldn't make him. And 10th grade dropout is what he became. Instead, he learned the electrician's trade well enough that he was able to wire an entire radio station. He was married 5 times, women of different colors, ages, and personalities. He got it right on wife number 5, who after his death adopted his daughter, Lakota. Kimberly is a fine person, mother and ideal daughter-in-law. My younger son died in 2019 at age 54. In 1971, we moved to California, south of Los Angeles. Our house was built on the side of a canyon and overlooked the Pacific Ocean, and we never tired of the view. A few months after we moved to Palos Verdes, we experienced an earthquake. The main roof beam twisted, and we were showered with plaster dust. The tile patio around the swimming pool cracked, but that was all the damage. Our main family activity was boating, and our favorite trips were to Catalina Island. Diesel fuel for the boat was only $1 per gallon. A very special experience in California was given us ride in a Stearman. That's a biplane who was owned by a friend. I told the pilot I was okay with him doing tricks. We flew above the shoreline, checked our airspace, and then did tricks including a loop. A thrilling maneuver in an open cockpit. The Stearman was a training plane for Navy pilots. It was bright yellow and had a canvas skin. My husband worked in Chatsworth, north of Los Angeles, and simply driving to and from the office took 3 hours. This made for long days and late dinners. Sleep time was shortened when I decided to go to graduate school at California State University, Long Beach branch. That's an hour from home. Bedtime was midnight, so even with a late bedtime, I was up at 4:30 to start a new day. I certainly learned the advantage of a 15-minute nap. My major was metalsmithing. I learned how to make a coffee pot, covered boxes, a bowl, and how to forge flatware. We also made some of our tools. I finished all my courses and studio work for a Master's of Arts and had my master's project approved when my husband at age 48 decided he was going to retire. He had had enough of long commutes, and taking sick companies and making them well got to be too much for him. After much discussion, we moved to St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. To make the move more palatable to our sons, who really had no interest in moving, we got a darling husky puppy. We arrived on island the week before Christmas. The house we purchased was a round house with a dome roof, with an 8-foot opening in the middle of the roof. When it rained, the water fell into a tropical garden in the center of the house. The roof was concrete that was supported by 6 flying buttresses that acted as catch basins that channeled the rainwater into a large cistern. This house was perched on the top of a hill 500 feet above the Caribbean. There was an observation terrace, and many nights were spent admiring the starry splendor of the skies, including the Southern Cross. The builder was Karl Dumpke, who had had a previous career as an officer in the German army in World War II until he was captured at Al Alamein and interred in a POW camp in the States. The couple who contracted him to build the house was a Dr. and Mrs. Murphy from Chicago. When Mrs. Murphy saw the house, she said, "I can't live here, it's too isolated." Not too long after that, the Murphys were divorced, and Mrs. M., who was known as Happy, married Nelson Rockefeller. St. Croix was a wonderful place to have a boat. The water was fabulous. About 1.5 miles northeast of the island is Buck Island National Monument. This small island is surrounded by a fringing reef, and the big draw for people is to snorkel in the lagoon, being careful not to make any contact with the mustard coral. My pick for volunteer job was to go on the Board of Governors of the Botanical Garden. The vegetation on St. Croix is lush and varied, and there were 64 plant species of pharmacological value. The Botanical Garden is situated on the grounds of an old plantation with ruined slave quarters and old graveyards surrounded by conch shells. In the late 1980s, I was asked to chair a lecture series by John Merwin, the last appointed governor of the islands. He was appointed by Eisenhower. The first lecture was labeled Women as Agents for Change. This lecture series was in memory of John's wife, who had recently died. Panelists were Honorable Barbara Hackett, a 6th District Judge, Martha Seeger, a member of the Federal Reserve Board, Jenny Jones, photographer, Barbara, and I'm sorry, I don't remember her name, who has her own public relations firm, my friend Elaine, who was a cattle woman, and lastly, a woman from the court on St. Thomas. Also, Bob Hartman, who was the speechwriter for President Ford. 2 other speakers were already committed for future lectures. George Bass, director of the Nautical Archaeology Institute in Texas, and Michael, a naturalist from the San Diego Zoo, who besides his regular zoo work led tours to New Guinea to find birds and plants. Unfortunately, Hurricane Hugo in 1989 reared its ugly head, and we only had the first lecture. The eye of Hugo crossed the island with gusts reaching 210 miles per hour. The anemometer flew off the airport terminal roof. 3 weeks before the hurricane, we had downsized to a house on the grounds of the Carambola Resort. The wind banging on the shutters caused the latches to suffer metal fatigue, and the shutters flew open. The strength of the wind inside the rooms on the upper floor scoured the walls clean of drywall. We ended up in the stairwell when the roof started to peel off, at which point we ducked down low, got into our car. Because of the wind force, the car bucked like a bronco all night long. The wind intensity was reduced in the morning, and resort staff came looking for survivors. We were taken to Carambola and given lodging, meals, and a choice of clothes. After 3 days, a temporary water system was assembled, and each person was allowed a 3-minute shower. So I went in fully clothed and washed hair, body, and clothes in 3 minutes. Hugo was not the first hurricane our family had experienced on St. Croix. Back in 1979, less than a year after we moved to the island, Hurricane David, followed a week later by Tropical Storm Frederick, struck the island. At the base of the hill on which our house was situated was an agriculture dam with an earthen wall. In a 24-hour period, we were deluged by 19 inches of rainfall that caused the dam to collapse. The rushing water scoured out deep ruts in the dirt road leading to the main road. A week later, bulldozers came, filled in the ruts, and we could then use the road. Returning to Hugo, I was evacuated from St. Croix a week later. The house we were living in was not inhabitable, and much of our furniture was not salvageable. What was saved was put into storage. My husband Joe stayed behind with our 2 dogs, put his business affairs in order, then flew to Cleveland, where we had family. Before Joe reached Cleveland, I left for India, a trip previously booked. In a raffle drawing, I had won a round-trip, first-class ticket to any city that was serviced by Pan Am. While in India, I mentally sorted out what changes the hurricanes made in our lives and what the future would be for us. We then relocated to Cleveland for 3 years. I'm going to say something about house insurance. We had house insurance, but the insurance company did not have adequate funds to pay the huge damage claims, and they went belly up. In 1984, I was painting the living rooms in my brother's house in St. Croix. I could not reach the highest part of one wall, so I put a stepladder and a cabinet, and then I could reach the highest part and finish the wall. Going up and down the ladder caused the ladder to walk off the cabinet and took me down with it. My left ankle was caught between the ladder halves. Acting like a pair of scissors, the ladder almost completely severed my foot from my leg. I looked at the injury and knew I was in big trouble. I was wearing a dress with a sash, and so I used the sash as a tourniquet, then pushed myself across the floor to where I could reach a phone and called for help. Upon reaching the hospital, my injury was examined and temporarily stabilized. Surgery would be performed 2 days later, as there was not enough doctors on island to perform the surgery immediately. Surgery number 1 was performed, but did not heal. So then came surgeries 2, 3, 4, and 5. I was in a wheelchair and on crutches for 10 months. What a thrill to finally start therapy. While living through this series of 5 surgeries and having time on my hands that I normally did not have on my hands, I decided that I would build a dollhouse. This is the dollhouse. It began life in 1984 when I was convalescing from an accident earlier in the year. With being in a wheelchair and crutches, I was limited in the activities that I had, but I thought doing a dollhouse would be just right. So this is now Cantomar. It is 18th century Spanish townhouse belonging to a rather prosperous merchant. That's all made up, of course, on that. And it took me 25 years to make this dollhouse. Most of the reason was that, well, I had to learn the trades first before I could put this together. I started from plain boards, and the base of the house is Spanish laid mahogany marine plywood. I didn't skimp on any of the quality of the materials that I put into this. Well, I then progressed and got the pieces cut, put together. I had blueprints, and the blueprints were for a New Orleans style house, but that didn't appeal to me, and I was currently living in a house that had previous memories, not of where I was now in St. Croix, but back in Southern California where I lived in a Spanish mission style house. And so I altered it. I found out by altering it that the one flight of stairs didn't do enough. It had to have a landing and extra stairs added to it. And before I even started on the dollhouse, I had made the kitchen pots and pans. Being a metalsmith by training, I was able to do that with a fair amount of skill. And it's not completely furnished either. I still have plans like more chairs, some books for the merchants, that's who lives in the house, office space. And I will probably also show you some little, very tiny sterling silver knives that I made for the cutlery for the fine dining table that we have in the dollhouse. We chose to move to Florida, specifically Palm Coast, which became a city on December the 31st, 99. Our house plans began as a series of pencil sketches on a large sheet of paper on our breakfast room table. After our hurricane experiences, we made sure that it was built above code. Construction went smoothly, and we and the dogs moved in a week before Christmas in 1992. It was nice to hear the Atlantic Ocean from our property. About the same time as we started construction, we traveled to Portugal and Madeira with 5 friends to celebrate my 60th birthday. Early one morning, while sketching a shore scene, I became aware that a number of human shadows surrounded me. Turning around, I saw a mixed group, all topless. I did not include them in my drawing. Back to Palm Coast. We lived in a community that abutted the Atlantic Ocean. It was like a conservation area, heavily wooded, with ponds scattered over the acreage in the golf course. Across from my house was a no-build area because Indian midden mounds in a gravesite dating back to 600 to 800 AD were found there by University of Florida archaeologists. Soon after moving there, I started to attend the monthly lectures at Whitney Lab. They were wide-ranging on science subjects. I had recently been on an elder hostel trip to Washington State to study the marine life and geology of that area. One day we took a research vessel out in the Sound and did a plankton tow, then followed up in the laboratory to see what had been caught in the net. This is where I got hooked on plankton, and beginning in the year 2000, began listing data of what I saw in weekly water samples for the lab. Now sit back and relax and just look at the pictures. In my 22 years at Whitney Lab, I never had a bad day. My 75th birthday party was held at the lab. I spent 2 years preparing for this event. It was a musical dinner party with handmade instruments made for all the guests. In the program was a line that read, "Music lesson." That was when my guests were taught how to play their instruments. The next line was, "The Blue Danube Waltz, an original arrangement for a large rhythm band." This was a unique musical experience. For the 9 people who had helped me plan and execute this party, I made 3-inch long sterling silver flutes. We had a Mediterranean dinner with a table centerpiece of a mermaid set in a bouquet of orange and blue flowers. I had a large bucket list consisting mostly of places I wanted to visit, like India, Hawaii, Australia, and Europe. These places I visited multiple times, and I felt enriched by my experiences on each trip. Taking time to sit down and sketch became a part of the street scene. That gave me a sense of kinship with the people around me. An example I'm going to give is Udaipur, India. An Indian friend who was living in Ohio made arrangements for me to stay for a few days in the hunting lodge of Arvind Singh Mewar, the Maharana of Udaipur. Upon checking in at the lodge, the man behind the desk asked, "Would you like to meet our king?" I answered yes, but I don't know how you go about meeting a king. Within an hour, an appointment was made for the following afternoon. I duly arrived at a reception room in the palace. Soon came the time for my visit, and I was escorted across a fountain-centered white marble terrace, up a few steps, through rich red velvet draperies into the king's handsome library. I was the only one meeting the king. I understood it was wise to bring a gift to the king. I handed him a cloisonné enamel dish with a lotus design. I had brought this dish as a wedding gift for someone, but felt it was more important to give it to the king. The king was curious about my camera, which was a Canon Futura, a type that came on the market just before cell phones, and it looked like a fat flashlight. Tea was brought, and a gift for me, a large book of Meyers-style paintings. After about an hour, my audience was over, and I returned to the hunting lodge. My status had risen because of my visit with the Maharana, and I found a freshly shellacked rocking chair and 2 rolls of pink toilet paper in my room. Another special travel moment was a cruise along the Norwegian coast from above the Arctic Circle to Bergen. The scenery was stark and bold and could have been used in a Wagnerian opera. Before beginning this trip, the tour manager phoned to ask me if there was anything special I wanted to do on this trip. The answer was yes. I wanted to sing the Norwegian anthem in Norwegian on a street corner in Oslo. His answer was no, because Norway was experiencing problems with immigrants who hassled pedestrians on the street. I also wanted to do a plankton tow in a harbor when the ship was docked. The answer was no, because I might be a nuisance in the offloading of cargo and passengers. And a third wish was to take a dog sled ride. Again, the answer was no, because sled rides were only offered on northbound cruises and my trip southbound. I still wanted to sing the national anthem, so I asked at the ship's office if I could have 5 copies of their anthem. The answer was yes. I coaxed 4 other travelers to sing with me. We practiced in the bar, where there was a piano, and we sang to our group the following evening. We were definitely not professional, but it was a special moment. The last special moment I will mention here was a hot air balloon ride in Northeast Australia. We arose shortly after 5 in the morning. The balloon lifted so gently that at first I was unaware that we were off the ground. I saw the prelude to the sunrise, then the actual sunrise. We floated over sparsely populated land, and I could see kangaroos curled up in pastures below. As gently as we lifted off, that gentleness repeating on our landing. There were 2 disturbing incidents in my travels, both in India. There was a time in Jaipur when the locals were very angry that Delhi was interfering with the kitchen burnings of young wives because the in-laws were pushing for more dowry money and were threatening harm to the young wives. There were protests by angry marchers in the street. We were sternly told not to say anything and to stay close in a group. The other time was in Kashmir in 1989. Militants crossed over the demarcation line from Pakistan and surged through the streets of Srinagar, firing guns indiscriminately. To get me to the airport, a driver and armed guard drove across an earth levee and circled around the city to the airport. I was hunkered down on the floor of the car out of sight. This experience taught me that no matter how much I wanted to be somewhere, did not mean it was a good idea to be there. My Kashmiri friend who owned a group of houseboats had a price put on his head, but he did survive. In 2014, my husband was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease for which there was no cure. We moved to a condo in 2017 on the Intercoastal Waterway. Memory problems appeared, and by 2020, I told Joe that his mind took him to a place where I could not follow. My life was severely curtailed, and I stopped everything except my 1-day-a-week volunteering at Whitney Lab. At the time when my husband could barely walk, we donated a Japanese garden with a centerpiece of an ancient hand-chiseled stone lantern. I helped create the garden. My husband passed away in March 2021 as interred at the Cape Canaveral National Cemetery. Volunteering at Whitney got me through the worst of the grieving, and 2 friends on staff whose opinions I respect recommended Oak Hammock. And here I am. In my life, I've had more than my share of wonderful moments, and I've also had more than my share of very painful moments. My life is guided by faith, and that has led me through my life. I started another bucket list. Soon I will fly to Amsterdam and spend a few days with a friend before boarding a ship to cruise to Iceland, Greenland, and Nova Scotia before docking in New York. See you when I return. Thank you for listening.
And now, before we have questions, Anne would like to take a few moments to say a few words in person, and then we'll have questions after that.
There are people that I really, really want to thank for their effort in putting this together.
Anne, pull the mic just toward you a little bit.
Okay,
There we go.
is this better?
Mhm.
Okay. I normally don't do this on that. I had mixed emotions about doing this job on that, but I did it thanks to Diane, who gave me a big shove on that. First off is thanks to Dick Martin. I'm sorry that he's not here in person because he's quite a creator of something out of nothing, and I thank him from the bottom of my heart. Then there's Frank Townsend on that end. He told me that for every hour of filming, it takes 3 to 4 hours of editing, right? Okay, thank you. Then Mary Connor, who I'm sure most of you know, if not all, she did the 2 paintings in the main salon of the dollhouse. The type of painting is called encaustic. That is a wax base with different colored pigments in it. And it certainly dresses up my dollhouse. And I've got here somebody who got up early this morning with his wife to come here. He was my supervisor for 22 years at Whitney. He got me through a lot. He taught me a lot. And we're still friends, good friends. I'd like to introduce Jose Nunez to you. Would you stand up, please? Many thanks. I even have some neighbors here. So if you think of a 200-mile round trip, they're special friends for coming. And I'm so glad they're here. Thinking back to my Aunt Lois and Uncle Jack, I have here a container with Hershey Kisses in it. And that was, as Dick Martin said to me, he said, a good marriage begins with a kiss. So in memory of my Aunt Lois and Uncle Jack, will you come help yourself? And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Anne, and I think we all want to give you a big kiss. Are there any questions at this point? I'm here with the microphone in the back. Yes, Pushpa, I'm on my way.
It's not a question. I enjoyed your talk. It's not a question. I just wanted to make a comment. You showed the picture of the king of Udaipur, and that guy, he looks weird, but he was in school with my brother-in-law.
Oh my
They were
gosh.
good friends. So when we went to Udaipur, my brother-in-law said, would you like to meet him? And I said, no, thanks. He looks weird. I don't want to meet him. So we did not meet him, but I recognized his picture. Yeah.
Great. I'm sorry for the quality of the pictures. I don't know why they're bleached out, but the originals are more color, certainly.
And Anne, you have a few compliments there in the chat. You can see them on screen, but everyone has enjoyed your presentation. Any other questions?
I have a question, actually. I was very privileged to be invited up to Anne's apartment to look at the dollhouse, which is fabulous. The roof wasn't on it, but I looked at that roof and I thought, oh my gosh, that must be really heavy. So Anne, can you tell us a little bit about the roof or anything else in the dollhouse that you'd like to share with us?
Sure. The roof is terracotta tiles. I made 4,600 of these little tiles for the roof, used almost all of them on the dollhouse. And in order to make them, I created a plate for a clay extruder gun. And that's how I got these long strips of clay. And then I cut them to size, dried them, and then they were fired. And then I didn't make every piece of furniture. My sister decided she'd help me. And I did find out in doing research that many of the wealthy Spanish families would go to England and custom order furniture for their homes. And I also did research on the types of furniture. The kitchen is modeled after a kitchen in a place called Colonial Tovar in Venezuela. The bench on which the clients of the merchant would sit is from Mexico, that style. There is a mural in the kitchen of the dollhouse that is a copy of a mural that's on the facade of one of the major buildings in St. Augustine. And that's the sort of stuff I did. Oh, and in the kitchen also is a small chair that is a copy of a chair in the kitchen of the house in which El Greco, the artist, lived in Toledo, Spain. So.
Okay, another question here.
Anne's talking.
Anne, did you hear the question?
Yes, I did.
Could you repeat it for everyone else?
Okay, I'm asked about the railings of the dollhouse. Anne has seen the dollhouse. And the tool that I used was a 6-inch lathe for that. The railing is African mahogany, which was easy to work with. And I did it all.
And thank you for your talk. You are an inspiration to us all. A reminder that life does not stop at 70 or 80 or even 90.
Yes,
Would you
yes.
like to tell us your latest learning adventure over at Wrights Union? What are you doing over there?
I'm finishing many unfinished projects. I figured I'm running out of time, so I better get these done. I went to a workshop on Nordic jewelry some years ago and learned how to do that. And so I'm putting those pieces together. And I'm doing things for the dollhouse. And I've made a number of pendants that are finished. One's even called green algae, which is not the normal subject of a piece of jewelry. So that's what I'm doing now. Besides, I didn't want to ask here if they would let me have a blowtorch in my apartment. I didn't think that would go.
And I was wondering, I'm sure all of us little girls had doll houses if we were lucky enough. Would there ever be a possibility that you could set up your doll house where we put the trains at Christmas time? And if we put security cameras on them, maybe you could let all of us really interested see it, and maybe you could even come and chat with us about it. I would just love, we don't want to come to your house and you don't want us all at your house, but I would love to be able to actually see it. It'd be wonderful. And thank you so much for your talk today.
Oh, you're welcome. I would be glad to have anybody come to my apartment if they would like to see the dollhouse. There are too many loose parts for it to be conveyed to another area. But you're welcome, just let me know. If you come early in the morning, I might not be up yet.
Other
I'll
questions?
also, Diane, I'll also add that when Anne got here, she very generously helped with many ILR programs already, so we appreciate that as well.
I was the benefit.
Other questions, comments? Well, Anne, here we have one more.
And I don't have a question. I just have to say what Jan said. You are an inspiration. You have accomplished so much in your life, and you're such fun to be with. So thank you so much. I'm so glad that your coworkers encourage you to move to Okemik. We're blessed.
Well,
that you're
Jose, who you met just this morning, was the one that even brought me here,
Yeah,
one of the trips.
that's great.
He said, "This is where you belong." He's right.
Okay, it's time now to run up and get a kiss from Anne, or a couple kisses. Okay, depends on your chocolate fix. But thank you so much, Anne. It was wonderful.
Thank you. You're welcome.